Hi, Polly here.
And this is Tortuga.
And this is Trek for Free Stories. Let's dive in.
Today's adventure. Lost medicine. Covered in time. A Peruvian countess. A Confederate blockade. A Georgia swamp tree that cured malaria for centuries. And the moment Japan nearly won World War II without firing a shot by capturing the world's quinine supply. Now, enjoy the story, mystery, adventure, and history.
It starts as a headache. Then the chills, the kind that rattle your teeth in July heat. Then the fever, 104, 105, the kind that makes you see things that aren't there. No urgent care, no IV drip, no prescription, with a list of side effects longer than your arm. You have two choices. Wait and see if your body wins, or find the bark.
The Countess, Lima, Peru, 1638. Her name was Ana de Osorio, Countess of Cinchona, wife of the Spanish viceroy, the most powerful woman in South America. The fever had her. The Quechua people of the Andes brought something to the Spanish, the bark of a mountain tree, ground to powder, dissolved in water. She drank it. The fever broke. It didn't come back. The story says she had the bark distributed to the poor of Lima, dying of the same fever. Word spread. Jesuit missionaries carried it back to Europe. They called it Jesuits' bark. Protestant Europe refused it for decades. If the Catholics were pushing it, it had to be a trick. Oliver Cromwell, the most powerful man in England, died of malaria rather than take Jesuits' bark. Pride killed him. The medicine was sitting right there. The tree was eventually named cinchona after the Countess. The active compound inside the bark, quinine, wouldn't be identified for another 182 years. The most valuable bark in the world. For 2 centuries, cinchona bark is the only reliable malaria treatment on Earth. Empires are built on it. Colonies are held by it. Armies live or die by their supply of a single South American tree. The British, practical as always, mix the powdered bark with gin and sugar to make it drinkable. That is where tonic water comes from. The gin and tonic is empire medicine. Every time you order one at a bar, you are drinking the descendant of a malaria treatment developed in the 1600s. But cinchona only grows in the Andes, Peru, Bolivia, Ecuador. Later, the Dutch transplant it to Java in the East Indies. The supply is controlled by whoever controls the mountains and the plantation. And in America, there is none, which becomes a very serious problem in 1861. The Confederate Gap and the paid collectors. The Union blockade cuts the Confederacy off from everything imported, including quinine. Confederate soldiers are dying of malaria by the thousands, not from bullets, not from cannon, from mosquitoes. The Confederacy has an army and no medicine for the fever that is eating it alive. A Virginia botanist named Francis Pear Porcher, commissioned by the Confederate government to catalog every southern plant that could replace what the blockade cut off. He publishes it in 1863, Resources of the Southern Fields and Forests. He finds it, Pinknea Georgia fever bark, growing in the wet forests and swamp edges of Georgia, Florida, and South Carolina, the whole time. Named for Charles Cotesworth Pinckney, a South Carolina founding father who signed the Constitution. The Cherokee and Creek had been using it for fevers for generations before any European arrived. William Bartram, the great Southern naturalist, documented it in 1773. Nobody in Richmond had bothered to ask.
Quinine, extracted from cinchona bark, is not folk medicine.
It is still an FDA-approved drug. It became the foundation of modern malaria treatment. The Cherokee were using the American version of it for centuries before Western medicine gave it a Latin name. The Georgia militia who survived swamp fever and shipped to Cuba carried that knowledge in their blood, something their grandmothers taught them that pharmaceutical companies would later figure out how to isolate, patent, and sell. And just like ginseng in the Apple Mountains, people were paid to collect it. Families who knew the swamps knew where the trees grew. They brought in bark for cash, the same way Apple Mountain families brought in sang. Wild harvesting. Family knowledge of locations kept secret and passed down. The same economy, a different tree. The war ends. The blockade lifts. Quinine comes back through normal supply chains. The fever bark gets covered again. The paid collectors go back to ginseng. The knowledge goes quiet until it's needed again. 1942. Japan invades the Dutch East Indies. Java, home of the world's cinchona plantations. They know exactly what they are capturing. Java supplied the majority of the world's quinine. In one campaign, without targeting a single Allied soldier directly, Japan cuts the Allied forces off from nearly all of it. Allied commanders in the Pacific watch their armies begin to collapse, not from combat, from mosquitoes. In New Guinea, the Solomon Islands, Burma, more Allied soldiers fall to malaria than to Japanese fire. Entire divisions are combat ineffective. Generals are sending sick men into battle because there is no one else to send. Japan understood something the history books understate. Losing your malaria medicine is as deadly as losing a battle. They may not have won the war with that single move, but they came closer than any textbook gives them credit for. The United States is now desperate, and desperation produces invention. American chemists, working against the clock, develop atabrine, a synthetic substitute. It works. It has side effects. It turns your skin yellow. Soldiers refuse to take it. The army has to station officers at mess halls to watch men swallow it. But it works. And now the knowledge lives in a laboratory, not in a tree. After the war, chloroquine and other synthesized compounds replace quinine entirely. The pharmaceutical industry patents the compounds. The cinchona tree becomes a historical curiosity. The bark that saved the world for 300 years is now a footnote. One man understood what this fever meant before the war, before the labs, before any of it. 1867. John Muir begins walking from Indiana to the Gulf of Mexico, 1,000 miles on foot. He wants to see the tropical plants. He reaches Cedar Key on Florida's Gulf Coast. Malaria takes him down for 3 months, delirious in a stranger's house, the bone-shaking cold, the clockwork fever. He nearly dies in Florida before he ever sees California, before he ever stands in Yosemite, before he becomes the man we know. He survives. He goes on to everything. But those 3 months in the Florida swamps gave Muir something most men in a comfortable life never get: a bone-deep understanding of what it costs to survive in a place that doesn't want you there. It changed how he saw wild land. It changed everything he wrote afterward. His full story is coming to Trek Free. The walk, the plants nobody else noticed, and the man who almost never made it to the mountains. What else have we forgotten? Here's what actually happened. The quinine compound was isolated, synthesized, patented, and manufactured into a pill. The pharmaceutical industry handed us that pill and called it the answer. The bark, the thing that worked reliably for 300 years, became folk medicine, snake oil. something uneducated people believed before we knew better. At the exact same moment, pharmaceutical companies were synthesizing those same plants into pills and charging accordingly. Meanwhile, the pill's side effects fill a page and a half of small print. The Cherokee knew about pinknia before Columbus landed. The Quechua of Peru knew about cinchona before the Spanish arrived. That knowledge was not lost because it didn't work. It was buried because you cannot patent a tree.
The same pattern runs through every one of these stories. Sang hunters in the Apple Hollows keeping their patches secret because the location had cash value. Georgia families collecting fever bark for Confederate apothecaries. Generations of people who knew things the medical establishment didn't bother to ask about until crisis forced them to ask. Then the crisis passed. The knowledge got covered again. What else is growing in a swamp right now that we've been trained to dismiss?
Last week, a gardener at the Aransas County History Center planted an herb garden. One of the plants is called Duranta, a flowering shrub native to the Gulf Coast and tropical Americas. The description card says it treats malaria and intestinal worms. The knowledge is still out there. Someone just bothered to plant it and write it down. That is the Foxfire moment, happening right now, in your town. The old way of preparing fever bark, whether cinchona from the Andes, Georgia fever bark from the southern swamps, or Duranta from your own backyard, was never complicated. Strip the inner bark, dry it in the shade, boil it in water for 20 minutes. Strain it. Drink it bitter, or cut it with a little honey if you had it. Your grandmother's grandmother knew this. The knowledge fit in one sentence. Oral traditions taught how to prepare, but they also taught what was dangerous. Very dangerous. These dangers were not passed to you. Do not try to make what you know nothing about. If you grow Duranta, the leaves are what traditional medicine uses. The berries are dangerously toxic. To people, to children, to pets. Bright and golden and deadly. Do not eat them. Do not let children near them. The plant that heals and the plant that harms are growing on the same branch. That is true of most things worth knowing. The bark didn't stop working. We just stopped looking. Lost Medicine, Covered in Time, is part of the Trek Free History series. Real places, real history, still there to walk.
I hope you enjoyed this episode of Trek for Free Adventure Stories. If this sounds like your kind of expedition, give us a thumbs up, subscribe so you can catch the next one. In the spirit of adventurers of yesteryear and the storytelling legends of Louis L'Amour, I hope we find a place in your travels. See you on the road. Until next time, adios.